I did not tell my son that the security cameras were working again, and that small decision would become the single most terrifying mistake, and at the same time, the most important lifeline of my life. Because when I finally opened the footage, my world collapsed in front of me, and I realized my own child was plotting my death with the woman he claimed to love. That night, the air was heavy in the house, like a storm waiting to break. I had brewed myself a late cup of chamomile tea and sat in the armchair by the window, listening to the wind move the branches outside. The television was on, but muted, just flickering light across the living room. My hands trembled a little, not from age, but from something I could not name yet. For weeks, I had felt something was wrong in my home. The glances my son David exchanged with his wife Rachel, the way their conversations stopped the moment I entered the room, the nervous laughter that never included me. But I told myself I was overthinking, that mothers sometimes misinterpret their children's private lives. Still, a feeling of dread gnawed at me, and that night I gave in to it. I walked quietly to the old desktop computer in the small study and opened the security program. The cameras had been broken for months, and I had quietly repaired them with the help of a neighbor who used to be an electrician. I never told David or Rachel because I thought it would be better to surprise them with working footage if we had another break-in. What I did not know was that this silence would save my life. When the program opened, the timeline of recordings filled the screen with little thumbnails. My pulse spiked as I clicked the folder marked with today's date. The feed flickered on, and I saw my living room from the angle of the ceiling camera. There they were. David pacing near the sofa, his hands clenching and unclenching. Rachel sitting on this edge of the coffee table, her voice low but clear enough for the microphone to catch. I pressed play and leaned closer until my nose almost touched the screen. "She is weaker every day," Rachel whispered. My stomach dropped. It will not take much. One wrong step on those stairs and the insurance money is ours. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would burst. Insurance money. My son's head lowered shame in his eyes, yet no refusal on his lips. "I cannot do this," he muttered, but Rachel's voice sharpened like a knife. "You can and you will. You said you were tired of living under her shadow. You said you wanted freedom. This is the only way." I froze. My son, my only child, was nodding slowly, giving in. The woman I had welcomed into my home was pushing him to kill me. The room around me blurred. I could barely breathe as my tea cooled untouched on the table. Tears welled up, but I forced them back because I needed to hear every word. Then came the detail that made my skin crawl. Rachel laughed softly, almost joyfully. "Do not worry, David. I have done this before. No one suspected when it happened to my first husband. They will not suspect now." My hand flew to my mouth to keep from screaming. My vision darkened at the edges. She had killed before, and she was planning to kill again. And this time, the target was me. The footage continued. They rehearsed it like actors in a cruel play. Rachel described exactly how to guide me to the top of the staircase, how to pretend to steady my arm, and then give one decisive push. David said nothing, but his silence was consent. He only asked in a broken voice, "What if she screams?" Rachel replied coldly. "She will not have time. By the time anyone finds her, it will be too late." My body shook. My throat closed. This was not some nightmare. It was real, captured on my own cameras. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade. I had raised him with everything I had after his father died. I had worked double shifts. I had missed meals so he could eat. And now his gratitude was to plot my death for money. I pressed pause on the footage and sat back, my breath ragged. In that silence, I heard the clock ticking on the wall and realized time was no longer on my side. They were planning to kill me within days, maybe within hours. At that moment, a memory surfaced like a cruel echo. Earlier that evening, Rachel had looked at me across the dinner table, her eyes bright but empty. She had asked casually, "Do you still use those old cameras in the corners of the house?" I had smiled vaguely and said nothing. She believed they were dead. That single omission was the reason I was alive to watch this footage. The weight of that realization crushed me, and yet it gave me power. I now held evidence, but evidence meant nothing if I was dead before I could show it. I whispered to myself, "Stay calm, Margaret. Stay alive long enough to expose them." My hands steadied on the desk. A surge of determination rose within me, stronger than the fear. The betrayal was unbearable, but it gave me clarity. My own son was willing to see me broken at the bottom of the stairs. My daughter-in-law had already claimed one life and was ready to claim another, but I was not going to let them write the ending of my story. I stared at the frozen frame on the screen, Rachel leaning close to David, her lips curved in a chilling smile, and I made a silent vow. They would not succeed. They would face justice, and I would live to see it. Pause for a moment and imagine this happening in your own life. Picture yourself sitting in your favorite chair at night, maybe with a cup of tea in hand, maybe with the hum of the refrigerator in the background, when suddenly you discover on a small glowing screen that your own son, the person you carried for 9 months, the boy whose first steps and first words you celebrated, is quietly planning your death for money. How would you react? Would you confront him immediately? Would you call the police? Would you pretend you knew nothing and gather more evidence? Or would you collapse in disbelief, unable to accept that blood could turn against you like this? I want you to really ask yourself, because this is not just my story. This is a warning for anyone who has sacrificed everything for their children, only to discover that love can be twisted by greed. If you are watching this from the United States, maybe from a quiet suburban neighborhood or a small town where you think betrayal only happens in movies, I ask you to think again. It happened to me, and it can happen to anyone. If you are watching from abroad, maybe from London, Toronto, or Sydney, tell me in the comments where you are from. I want to know how far these stories of family betrayal travel across the world. Do not just sit there silently. Share your thoughts, because the more we talk about elder abuse, the harder it becomes for people like Rachel to hide in plain sight. If you have faced something similar, maybe not as extreme, but a moment when your own family turned on you for money or control, tell me in the comments. Others reading will realize they are not alone. And before you continue with my story, take a second to subscribe and click the like button. It might seem like a small action, but it helps this channel grow so that more people, especially those over 50 who need to hear these warnings, can find them. I promise you the rest of this story will shake you even more. What I discovered after that first night on the footage did not just involve betrayal. It involved a plan darker and colder than I could have imagined. Stay with me, because what comes next is where the nightmare truly begins. My name is Margaret, and I am 62 years old. If you saw me on the street, you would think I was an ordinary woman living a quiet life in a modest American town. I worked at the public library for over 30 years, surrounded by books and stories while quietly living out my own. My late husband, John, was a construction foreman, a man of calloused hands and gentle humor who never came home without a smile, even when he was exhausted. We met in church when I was just 21 and married within a year, because when you know, you know. Our marriage lasted 38 years until tragedy struck on a job site. A scaffold collapsed and he never came home again. That day, I felt as if half my heart had been ripped out. Still, I had to keep going because I had David, our only son, to raise. David was 8 when his father died, and the world suddenly became a different place for him. I remember sitting by his bed that night, watching his little chest rise and fall in sleep while I whispered promises that I would protect him, provide for him, and make sure he never felt alone. I kept those promises with every ounce of strength I had. I took on extra shifts at the library. I babysat neighbors' children on weekends. I sold John's old truck to pay for David's schooling. We lived modestly, but I always made sure David had what he needed. New shoes for school, a bicycle on his 12th birthday, college tuition, even though it nearly broke me. I believed that sacrifice was what mothers did. David grew into a tall boy, but he was never steady. He switched majors in college 3 times, then dropped out. He worked odd jobs for a while, but could never keep one longer than a year. When he met Rachel, he seemed happier, and I allowed myself to believe maybe she was the one who would bring him stability. Rachel was beautiful, polished, confident. She spoke with the kind of certainty that made people nod along, even if they disagreed. At first, I welcomed her into our family with open arms because all I wanted was for David to be loved. I gave them the master bedroom when they moved in temporarily while saving for their own place. I cooked dinners, I folded their laundry, I even loaned them money more than once. I thought this is what family does. But over time, small cracks appeared. Rachel liked expensive clothes and dinners at restaurants far beyond what David could afford. She complained about our modest house, the creaky stairs, the old furniture. She would make comments like, "Margaret, you really should update this place. It feels so dated," with a smile that was not quite a smile. At first, I brushed it off, thinking she was young and did not understand. But then I noticed how David began echoing her complaints. He, too, would look around the house and sigh as if it were a prison, not a home built by the sweat of his father's hands. There were moments that should have warned me. One Thanksgiving, Rachel asked pointedly about my savings and insurance policies. She said she was just concerned about my security, but the way her eyes gleamed made me uneasy. Another time, David suggested maybe I should sign a power of attorney to make things easier in case something happens. I laughed it off, but inside I felt a cold shiver. Who thinks of such things unless they are planning for them? I tried to ignore those warning bells because my heart refused to believe my only son would ever harm me. I told myself Rachel was simply ambitious, that David was just repeating what she said. I reminded myself of the boy who used to climb into my lap after school and cry when kids teased him. I remembered his little hands clutching mine at his father's funeral. I held on to those memories like a shield against the discomfort of the present. But reality kept intruding. Last winter, I caught Rachel rifling through my desk drawers. When I asked what she was doing, she smiled and said she was looking for a pen. My gut told me she was lying, but I let it go. Then there was the time David asked me bluntly how much the house was worth. When I said I did not know, he pressed further about whether I had considered selling. I reminded him gently that this was the home his father built with his own hands, and that it was all I had left. He shrugged as if sentimental value meant nothing. As the months passed, Rachel grew bolder. She criticized me openly, telling David that I was old-fashioned, too cautious, even a burden. One night, I overheard her telling him, "We could have a better life if your mother was not dragging you down." My heart cracked hearing those words, yet David said nothing in my defense. That silence hurt more than the words themselves. Still, I tried to maintain peace. I told myself maybe they were stressed about money. Maybe they were arguing and I was caught in the middle. I cooked their favorite meals. I smiled through the tension. I prayed for patience. Deep down, though, a voice whispered that something darker was brewing. It was around this time that I decided to quietly repair the old security cameras. We had installed them years ago after a neighborhood break-in, but they stopped working and I never had the money to replace them. A retired neighbor who used to be an electrician offered to help me fix them. Together, we spent an afternoon climbing ladders, tightening wires, and finally watching the small green lights flicker back to life. I felt a surge of relief knowing I had eyes in the corners again. I never told David or Rachel because I thought it would be amusing to surprise them if a raccoon triggered the motion sensors. That secrecy turned out to be the thread that unraveled everything. Looking back now, I can see the story forming like a tragic novel. A widowed mother who gave her life to her son, a son who never found his footing, a daughter-in-law whose hunger for luxury outweighed her conscience, and me caught between love and suspicion, trying to believe in family even as the ground beneath me began to crack. If you are listening to this and you are over 50, perhaps you feel the same tension in your own life. Maybe you have a child who takes more than they give, or an in-law who watches you with calculating eyes. Maybe you dismiss it as paranoia. I did too. I told myself blood ties meant loyalty. I believed sacrifice guaranteed gratitude. But gratitude can be swallowed whole by greed, and loyalty can be twisted until it breaks. I learned that truth the hardest way possible. The first real crack in the surface came one evening in early spring when the three of us sat down for dinner. I had made roasted chicken with potatoes because it was David's favorite from childhood. I remember carefully setting the table with the old China John and I had bought at a yard sale decades earlier. Rachel arrived late as usual, carrying shopping bags from an upscale boutique downtown. She set them down with a dramatic sigh and slid into her chair. While David began eating immediately, Rachel picked at the food without interest. After a few minutes, she looked at me with that too bright smile of hers and said casually, almost sweetly, "Margaret, have you thought about getting a life insurance policy lately? Something substantial, maybe $2 million. You know, just to make sure David is secure when you are gone." The words dropped like stones into the room. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. She said it so smoothly as if it were normal dinner conversation. I forced a laugh and replied that I was healthy and did not plan on going anywhere soon. But inside, a chill spread through my chest. Rachel continued unfazed. You never know, accidents happen all the time. It would be a shame if something unexpected left David with nothing. She reached over and patted his hand. He looked down at his plate, not meeting my eyes. I chewed slowly, trying to hide the tremor in my hands. That night, after they went upstairs, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty plates and hearing her words echo. Accidents happen. Secure when you are gone. A week later, another small moment set my nerves on edge. I was dusting in the living room when Rachel wandered in with a glass of wine. She looked up at the corners of the room where the security cameras were mounted. They were small black domes, easy to miss unless you were looking for them. She pointed with her glass and asked lightly, "Do these old things still work? They look ancient." My heart skipped, but I kept my expression calm. I shrugged and said, "I do not think so. They have been broken for years." Rachel smirked and took a sip of wine. Figures. No one bothers with cameras in a quiet town like this anyway. She walked away, humming to herself. She had no idea that the lights inside those domes glowed green once again. She had no idea her own curiosity would be her undoing. Over the next days, I began to notice Rachel paying unusual attention to my routines. She watched when I climbed the stairs. She watched how I held the railing. Once, she even suggested I move my bedroom upstairs instead of downstairs, claiming it would be healthier exercise. Something in her tone made my stomach twist. Why suddenly encourage me to take the stairs more often unless she was imagining how easy it would be for one slip to end everything? The clues kept adding up. David started pressing more about finances. He asked how much the house was worth and whether I had considered signing papers to streamline things if I ever became ill. He mentioned that Rachel had found a lawyer who specialized in estate planning. Each time I deflected, but I felt like an animal being slowly cornered. They were circling me, waiting for the right moment. The final clue came late one evening as I passed by their bedroom door. I heard Rachel's voice, low and sharp through the wood. "She will not last forever, David. We need to be ready. If we push her now, we can start fresh. The insurance money will cover everything." My knees nearly buckled. I pressed a hand against the wall to steady myself. I did not catch David's reply, but the silence that followed was worse than words. Silence meant agreement. Silence meant he was already lost to me. I returned to my room that night shaking. The image of my sweet boy with ice cream dripping down his chin after a baseball game clashed violently with the image of the man who sat quietly while his wife planned my death. The first clues were not just whispers anymore. They were shouts echoing in my ears, telling me danger was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. The night everything shifted forever began quietly. I had made myself a cup of tea and carried it into the small study where the computer sat against the wall. The cameras had been running for weeks now, recording silently storing footage I had never bothered to review. But after Rachel's remark about the stairs, something inside me demanded to look. My hands trembled as I moved the mouse and opened the security program. A list of video files appeared, each stamped with date and time. I clicked on the most recent one. The feed flickered to life, showing the living room from the wide angle of the ceiling camera. At first, there was nothing unusual, just the sofa, the television, the glow of the lamp. Then David entered, pacing back and forth, his hands rubbing together. He looked nervous, agitated like a man caught in a storm of his own making. Moments later, Rachel walked in. She sat on the edge of the coffee table, leaning forward, her eyes sharp, her voice low. "It has to be soon," she said. "She is too strong for her age. If we wait, she might decide to change her will. The money is in reach. We just have to act." My stomach twisted so hard I thought I might vomit. I leaned closer to the screen. David muttered something, but Rachel cut him off. "You promised me, David. You said you were tired of living under her rules. You said you wanted freedom. Then do not back out now." My son dropped into the armchair, his face buried in his hands. "I cannot believe we are even talking about this," he whispered. "She is my mother." Rachel's tone turned icy. and she is standing in the way of our future. You want that big house, you want the car, you want to start the business. You cannot do that while you are chained to her. Do you think she will live forever? I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling my heartbeat slam against my ribs. Then Rachel leaned closer, her voice dropping even more. Do not worry, David. I know how to handle it. Remember my first husband. Everyone thought it was an accident. No one questioned it. This will be no different. My hand flew to my mouth. First husband. Accident. My mind reeled. Was she confessing to murder right there in my living room? David lifted his head, his voice shaking. How, he asked. Rachel smiled a cold smile that made my blood freeze even through the grainy footage. The stairs, she said simply. She always uses the railing. All it takes is one push. By the time anyone finds her, it will be too late. The insurance will pay quickly. We will be free. I gasped so loudly I was afraid they would hear me through the walls, even though I was alone in the study. The tea on the desk went cold, untouched. Tears blurred my vision. My own son was sitting there listening while his wife planned my death step by step. He did not shout. He did not walk out. He did not protect me. He sat silently and let her words seep into him. That silence was betrayal louder than any scream. I paused the footage, but my body kept trembling. My mind screamed at me to run, to pack a bag, and disappear into the night. But another voice, deeper, steadier, told me to keep watching. I needed every word, every detail. My safety depended on proof. I forced my shaking hand to press play again. Rachel's voice filled the room once more. Tomorrow night she takes her tea and goes upstairs. I will suggest she move back into the upstairs bedroom. We guide her up gently, then I give the push. You will not have to touch her. It will look like an accident. You just need to be calm afterward. Cry. Call the ambulance. Say you tried to help. David nodded slowly, like a man surrendering his soul. I bit my lip until I tasted blood. Tomorrow night. They were planning to kill me within 24 hours. I clutched the edge of the desk to steady myself as nausea rose. For a moment, the screen blurred with tears, and I almost collapsed. The betrayal cut through every memory, every sacrifice, every bedtime story, every scraped knee I had kissed. I whispered to myself over and over, "Stay calm, Margaret. Stay calm," because panic would get me killed. What I needed was a plan. The camera had given me the truth. Now I had to decide what to do with it. I sat in the dark, staring at the frozen frame of Rachel's face, twisted into a calculating smile. My own son sat beside her looking like a shadow of the boy I once knew. I remembered his first day of school, his hand clutching mine so tightly. I remembered the night of his high school graduation when he hugged me and said, "Thanks, Mom, I could not have done it without you." Those memories stabbed at me now, cruel reminders of what I had lost. But beneath the grief, a new resolve hardened. They thought I was weak. They thought I was blind. They thought I was too old to fight back. They were wrong. I was still alive. I still had a mind sharper than they realized, and now I had proof. I closed the program and backed up the footage to a flash drive, my hands moving with grim precision. I hid the drive under the lining of an old jewelry box in my bedroom. Then I sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the darkness until dawn. I could hear them moving upstairs, laughing softly like any young couple. The sound made my skin crawl. They thought they already owned my future. They had no idea I had seen behind their masks. When the first light of morning slipped through the curtains, I whispered aloud to myself, "This is not over. They will not win. I will live to see them face justice." And with that vow burning in my chest, the terror inside me began to shift into something else. Not hope, not yet, but determination. And that determination would carry me through the nightmare that was only just beginning. After that night, nothing in the house felt the same. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of voices upstairs made my skin tighten. I moved carefully, never letting them see my fear, but inside I was counting every moment until they acted. Their plan was set and they believed I was blind. That gave me a fragile window of advantage. The first escalation came the very next evening. Rachel brought me a cup of tea, her smile too sweet. "Chamomile, Margaret. Helps you sleep." I stared at the steaming mug in her hand and felt my stomach twist. I took it, but did not drink. When she left the room, I poured it slowly into the sink and watched the liquid swirl down the drain. Was it poisoned? I would never know, but my instincts screamed not to trust it. Later, David knocked on my bedroom door. He leaned against the frame awkwardly. Mom, Rachel, and I were thinking, maybe you should move back upstairs. You'll have more space up there and the view is better. You'll feel younger climbing the stairs. His tone was rehearsed, too casual. I forced a smile. That's thoughtful, David, but I like it down here. My knees aren't what they used to be. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. When he walked away, I heard Rachel's hiss from the hallway. She has to go up there. Without that, it won't work. My heart thudded. They were growing impatient. Days later, David slid papers across the kitchen table. Power of attorney, he explained, avoiding my eyes. Just in case you know something happens. It will make things easier for me to handle the bills. My fingers hovered above the page. If I signed, they would own me before I was even dead. I set the pen down. I'll think about it. His eyes hardened. Rachel's cousin knows a lawyer who can help. Don't drag this out. The son I had raised the boy I once rocked to sleep was now pressuring me to sign away my life. Rachel escalated further. She followed me around the house with false concern, touching my arm as I climbed the stairs, testing the strength of the railing. Once, as I carried laundry up, she brushed against me just enough to make me wobble. Her eyes flicked to the steps below, and a small smile curved her lips. It was a rehearsal, a test. My breath caught as I steadied myself. She laughed lightly. Careful, Margaret. Wouldn't want you to fall. Each day, the tension thickened until I could hardly breathe. At night, I lay awake, listening to the faint murmur of their voices upstairs. I could not make out the words, but I could hear the cadence of plotting. I imagined them rehearsing my death like actors practicing lines. One afternoon, I decided to test Rachel. I pretended to nap on the couch, letting my breathing slow, my eyes half closed. Through the reflection in the darkened television screen, I saw her stand in the doorway watching me. She did not move for a long minute. Then she stepped closer and whispered under her breath, "Soon." I fought the urge to shiver. She turned and walked away, leaving the echo of that single word vibrating in my bones. I knew then this was no longer a vague danger. It was imminent. I began quietly moving cash and important documents into a locked box I hid in the attic. I copied the camera footage onto 2 more flash drives, hiding one under the lining of an old purse and the other inside a jar of flour in the pantry. If they destroyed one, I would still have another. Still, fear gnawed at me. They were growing bolder. Rachel's voice grew sharper, her control over David more obvious. She mocked him when he hesitated, calling him weak, telling him he had no future unless he proved himself. And he listened. He bent under her words like a tree in the wind. Watching my son surrender piece by piece to her darkness was almost worse than the threat itself. The final escalation came on a rainy night when the storm beat against the windows. I was in my room when I heard footsteps on the stairs. I crept to the crack of my door and peered out. Rachel stood at the top of the staircase with David behind her. She pressed his hands against the banister and whispered, "This is where it happens. Tomorrow night. No delays." David swallowed hard and nodded. My knees nearly gave out, but I forced myself back into the room silently. Tomorrow night. The countdown had begun. I sat on the edge of my bed, my breath shallow, my hands clenched in fists. They were ready to strike, but they had underestimated me. I was not powerless. I was not naive. I had seen everything, and I was ready to turn their plan against them. The terror in my chest transformed into a cold, steady determination. If they wanted tomorrow night to be the end, then tomorrow night would be their downfall. The morning after I overheard Rachel set the timeline, I knew I could not face this battle alone. My strength and my proof mattered, but without allies, I would be another story whispered in the newspaper, another tragic accident dismissed by neighbors. I needed people who would believe me, people with the skills to stop them before it was too late. The first person I thought of was Grace, an attorney I had met years earlier when she gave a presentation at the library about elder law and estate planning. She was in her mid-50s, sharp-eyed and calm-voiced, the kind of woman who radiated authority without raising her tone. I still had her card tucked into a drawer. With trembling hands, I called her office and explained that it was urgent. Within hours, she met me at a quiet cafe across town. I brought one of the flash drives. My fingers shook as I slid it across the table. "Please, watch this," I whispered. Grace plugged it into her laptop. As the footage played, her face shifted from confusion to shock to grim determination. When it ended, she closed the screen and looked at me squarely. "Margaret, you are in very real danger, but you also have the kind of evidence most people never get. We can use this. The key is to act quickly and carefully." Grace explained my legal options. The power of attorney papers David tried to push meant they were preparing to seize everything. She urged me not to sign anything and promised to draft documents securing my ownership of the house. She also recommended we involve law enforcement immediately. That led me to Detective Miller, a veteran officer known for his work on fraud and elder exploitation cases. Grace arranged the meeting. In a small conference room at the police station, I sat clutching my purse as the detective examined the footage. His jaw tightened as Rachel's voice filled the room. When the clip ended, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "This is enough to open a case," he said, "but to secure convictions, we need to catch them in the act, or at least get them on record trying to carry it out." He looked me straight in the eye. "Are you willing to work with us on a controlled operation?" My throat went dry, but I nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes to stop them." To protect myself in the meantime, I needed medical validation. Rachel's plan included the possibility of declaring me incompetent to make my own decisions. So, Grace sent me to Dr. Levine, a respected physician who specialized in geriatric care. He ran a full cognitive assessment and physical exam, then signed a statement affirming that I was healthy alert and fully capable of managing my affairs. Holding that document felt like carrying a shield. Still, I needed emotional support too. That came from Helen, my oldest friend from church. When I told her everything, her eyes widened with horror, and she clasped my hands. "You are not staying in that house alone another night," she declared. She offered me a spare room, but I explained the police wanted me to stay in place until the operation was ready. She insisted on checking in daily and pressed a small cross into my palm. "Keep this with you," she said. "You are not alone." Together, my allies began weaving a safety net. Grace handled the legal filings, ensuring no sudden signatures could strip me of my property. Detective Miller coordinated with a small trusted team at the department, setting up surveillance and planning a sting. Dr. Levine's report was filed with the police case notes to prevent any manipulation about my mental state. Helen became my emotional anchor, calling each night to remind me I was loved. For the first time since I discovered the footage, I felt a flicker of strength. The burden no longer rested on my shoulders alone. Each ally brought a piece of protection like bricks, building a wall between me and the danger upstairs. Still, the risk was real. The detective warned me not to underestimate Rachel. "She has done this before," he reminded me. "That makes her more dangerous, not less. But it also means she is overconfident. That's where we can catch her." I returned home that evening with my heart pounding but steadier. Rachel and David sat in the living room watching television. They looked up casually as I entered, unaware that the noose of justice was tightening around them. I smiled faintly, hiding the fire burning inside me. They thought I was still their prey. They had no idea I had allies waiting in the shadows, ready to strike. From the moment Detective Miller laid out the plan, I began counting time not in days but in hours. Every tick of the clock felt like thunder in my ears. The storm was approaching, and I had to survive long enough for the trap to spring. 72 hours before their planned attack, Rachel grew restless. She circled me like a hawk circling prey. At breakfast, she leaned over and touched my arm lightly, her nails sharp against my skin. "Margaret, I really think you should move upstairs this weekend. The light is so much better up there. You'll feel alive again." I forced a smile and shook my head. Inside, I recorded her words in my memory. Proof, evidence, a piece of the puzzle. 48 hours before I overheard them again through the thin walls. Rachel's voice low and fierce. "She's stubborn, but we cannot wait. Tomorrow night is final. If she refuses the stairs, we make her go." David mumbled something I could not catch. Then silence. That silence was worse than any words. It meant agreement. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house felt like a signal of doom. I gripped the cross Helen had given me and whispered prayers into the darkness. Not for miracles, but for strength to endure. 36 hours before Rachel appeared at my door with a pair of new high-heeled shoes in her hand. She laughed and said she had been practicing walking in them, but then she stepped deliberately onto the first stair, shifted her weight, and rocked dangerously before catching herself. She glanced back at me with a smirk. "Slippery, isn't it, Margaret?" One wrong step. My stomach churned, but I only nodded. 24 hours before Detective Miller called. His voice was steady but urgent. "We're ready. Cameras are set. Officers will be nearby. Stay calm, follow your routine, and when they move, we'll be there." I thanked him quietly. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange calmness settle over me. The fear had not left, but it had hardened into steel. 12 hours before Rachel brought me another cup of tea. I accepted it, smiled, and later poured it down the sink as usual. My reflection in the kitchen window showed a woman who looked tired but unbroken. I whispered to her, "Hold on. Justice is close." 6 hours before I sat alone in the living room as the house darkened. The rain tapped against the windows. I could hear faint laughter from upstairs. They were relaxed, confident, certain of their victory. They had no idea they were already walking into a trap. By the time the final hour arrived, my nerves felt stretched thin as wire. I could hear their footsteps above me pacing, pausing, whispering. The plan was in motion. My heart pounded, but my resolve burned brighter. This was the night everything would be decided. Either I would die at the bottom of those stairs, or I would live to watch them taken away in handcuffs. And I was determined it would be the latter. The final night arrived cloaked in silence, broken only by the steady drumming of rain on the roof. I sat in the living room, a blanket over my lap, pretending to read while every muscle in my body coiled tight. The camera system was recording. Detective Miller's team was stationed in unmarked cars nearby. My allies were ready. Now it was up to me to play my part. Rachel entered first, her perfume filling the room like smoke. She smiled too brightly. "Margaret, why don't you come upstairs tonight? It will be cozy. David and I want to talk with you." Her tone was syrup hiding poison. David appeared behind her, his face pale, his eyes darting. He looked like a man drowning in guilt, yet unwilling to swim to safety. I rose slowly, feigning weariness. "All right," I said softly. "Let's go upstairs." Rachel's smile widened triumphant. She slipped her arm through mine and guided me toward the staircase. My knees trembled, but not from age. At the top of the stairs, the air felt heavy, charged. Rachel tightened her grip. I knew this was the moment. Just as her hand shifted ready to shove, I stopped and turned. My voice rang louder than I expected. "Before you try, there's something you need to see." I pulled the small remote from my pocket and pressed the button. The television downstairs flickered to life. On the screen appeared the footage from the hidden camera, the recording of Rachel whispering about pushing me, confessing about her first husband, planning every detail. Rachel froze her mouth open. David staggered back, eyes wide. "What is this?" he stammered. I stared at them both. "It is the truth, and it is already in the hands of the police." Rachel's mask cracked. Her smile vanished, replaced by fury. "You stupid old woman," she hissed. "Do you think anyone will believe you? They will say you edited it. They will say you're senile." I stepped closer, my voice steady. "Dr. Levine certified my mind is sound. Grace has filed the paperwork. The police are listening right now." For the first time, fear flickered in her eyes. David muttered, "Rachel, is this true? Did you—" He trailed off, but Rachel snapped at him. "Shut up! We're in this together. Do not turn weak now." That was when the pounding began. Heavy footsteps on the porch. The front door burst open and officers surged inside, shouting police. "Do not move!" Rachel spun toward the stairs as if to run, but 2 officers were already climbing. She was caught between them. David raised his hands, his face ashen. Detective Miller appeared, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Rachel Green. David Collins, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and attempted elder abuse." Handcuffs clicked. Rachel screamed, struggling, spitting venomous words. "You ruined everything, Margaret. You should have just died quietly." David sagged, tears streaming down his face as the cuffs tightened around his wrists. I stood at the top of the stairs, my legs shaking, but I forced myself to watch. I wanted to see the truth laid bare. The son I had raised was being led away like a criminal. The woman who had infiltrated my family was shrieking curses, and I was still alive. As they were escorted outside into the flashing lights of the squad cars, Detective Miller turned to me. "You did well, Margaret. You stayed calm. You gave us what we needed." I nodded silently, clutching the railing for support. My body trembled with exhaustion, but my spirit surged with something else vindication. The house fell silent again once they were gone. I sank into the nearest chair, the weight of years and heartbreak pressing down. Tears came then hot and relentless. I cried not only for the danger I had escaped, but for the boy I had lost long before tonight. My son had chosen greed over love, and now he would pay the price. The weeks that followed felt like moving through a storm that refused to end. After the arrests, the house was quieter, but the silence was heavy, full of memories I could not escape. Each day I drove to meetings with Grace and Detective Miller preparing for court. The footage became the centerpiece of the case. It was undeniable, Rachel's voice crystal clear as she described pushing me down the stairs, her laughter when she referenced her first husband's so-called accident, David's silence that served as consent. The trial began 3 months later in the county courthouse. The building smelled of old wood and disinfectant, a place where lives were measured and weighed. I sat at the front with Grace beside me, my hands clenched together in my lap. When Rachel was led in wearing the orange prison jumpsuit, her eyes burned with hatred. David shuffled behind her, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. His shoulders slumped, his face pale. For a moment, my heart twisted with grief. He was my son no matter what he had done. But grief did not erase truth. The prosecution laid out the evidence piece by piece. They played the footage on a large screen for the jury. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Rachel's cold voice filled the room. All it takes is one push. By the time anyone finds her, it will be too late. They showed her confession about her first husband. They highlighted David's complicity, his willingness to sign away my rights through power of attorney. Dr. Levine testified that I was mentally sound. Grace introduced the documents protecting my property. Every angle was covered. Rachel's defense tried to argue that the footage was manipulated, that I was a vindictive mother trying to destroy her son's marriage. But the jury could see through the lies. The pattern of her past, the insurance documents, even neighbors testifying about her lavish spending, painted a picture of greed sharpened into cruelty. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for only 6 hours. When they returned, the verdict was clear. Rachel was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, attempted elder abuse, and fraud. She was sentenced to 35 years in state prison. David was convicted as an accomplice and given 20 years. The judge looked at him with weary eyes and said, "You had every chance to walk away. You chose betrayal. Now you face the consequences." As the gavel fell, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served. My life was safe. But the boy I once carried in my arms would now spend decades behind bars. Rachel shot me one last venomous glare as she was led away. David did not look at me at all. After court, Detective Miller placed a hand on my shoulder. "You were brave, Margaret. Most people never find the strength to fight back. You did, and you won." Grace smiled gently and said, "Now you can live without fear." I nodded but said nothing. My heart was too full of conflicting emotions. Justice had a price, and for me, that price was family. When the trial ended and the courthouse doors closed behind me, I stepped out into the crisp autumn air and felt the first true breath of freedom I had taken in months. The leaves had turned gold and red along Main Street, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could look at the sky without fear that someone was waiting to push me into the shadows. My home was mine again. The cameras still blinked silently in the corners, but now they gave me comfort, not dread. Each night I locked the doors, fed the little terrier I had adopted from the shelter, and sat in my living room with a sense of peace. The echoes of Rachel's voice were fading, replaced by the gentle rhythm of my own quiet life. But the scars remained. When I walked past the stairs, I sometimes felt a phantom shove at my back. When I heard laughter from a couple on the street, my stomach clenched, remembering the sound of my son laughing nervously as Rachel planned my death. Healing would take time. I knew that. And yet I refused to let fear define the rest of my years. With Grace's encouragement, I began speaking at community centers about elder abuse and financial exploitation. The first time I stood at a podium, my hands trembled, but as I looked out at the faces of men and women my age, I saw recognition in their eyes. They too had felt the sting of betrayal, maybe not as extreme, but real nonetheless. I told them my story in careful detail and urged them to trust their instincts to protect their assets, to never assume blood ties meant loyalty. Afterward, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Your story saved me." I was about to sign papers I did not understand. Now I won't. That moment gave my suffering meaning. Helen remained my anchor visiting, often bringing pies and fresh flowers. Detective Miller checked in occasionally to let me know the system had not forgotten my courage. Even Dr. Levine sent a note reminding me that strength was not measured in years, but in choices. Slowly, I built a new kind of family, not of blood, but of trust. As for David, I chose not to visit him in prison. Letters arrived at first full of apologies and excuses, but I left them unopened in a drawer. Perhaps one day I will read them. Perhaps not. Forgiveness is a mountain I am not yet ready to climb. Rachel tried once to send word through another inmate, but I refused to receive it. Her chapter in my life is closed forever. One quiet evening, as the sun set through the kitchen window, I brewed a cup of chamomile tea the way I always had. I carried it upstairs deliberately, one step at a time, until I reached the top. I stood there looking down at the staircase that was meant to be my grave. Instead, it became my victory. I whispered to myself, "You tried to end me here, but I am still standing." And with that, I turned away stronger for the journey. If you are listening to my story, remember this: family is not defined by blood alone. True family is built on love, respect, and loyalty. Betrayal can come from those closest to us, but so can strength when we choose allies who believe in us. Do not ignore the signs. Protect yourself. And above all, never let anyone convince you that your age makes you powerless. This is my truth. I survived. I fought back, and justice was served. Now I live each day not in fear, but in dignity. And I hope my story becomes a light for others walking through their own shadows.